A man spent years walking free in Brooklyn while, according to federal prosecutors, he helped plan the murder of a journalist a few subway stops away. He's now been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The journalist he's accused of targeting is a New York-based writer and one of the most prominent public critics of the Iranian government living anywhere in the United States. According to the Justice Department, this case isn't an isolated one. Prosecutors describe it as part of a wider pattern. Operatives connected to Tehran, reaching across an ocean, trying to silence people who left Iran and kept speaking anyway. Here's what we're covering: how a stalking campaign against a single journalist turned into a murder-for-hire case, what investigators say actually happened in the order the record describes it, why prosecutors keep using a specific phrase, transnational repression, to describe cases like this one, and where this particular case stands right now, including what a 15-year sentence actually means under federal law. One thing before we go further. A sentencing means a conviction has already happened, whether by plea or by verdict, but we're not going to state facts beyond what the record actually supports. Anyone we haven't named, or anyone described only as connected to a broader network, is still entitled to the presumption of innocence for anything not yet proven against them specifically. This is a factual explainer, not a dramatization. We're not going to invent scenes, quotes, or details we can't source. If a detail isn't confirmed, we'll say so plainly instead of filling the gap. So here's what prosecutors say happened. According to federal prosecutors, a Brooklyn man was sentenced to 15 years for his role in two connected things: a plot to arrange the murder of a journalist and a sustained campaign of stalking directed at that same journalist. Court records, as described by the Justice Department, frame this as part of a broader effort by individuals linked to the Iranian government to target dissidents and vocal critics living, working, and speaking freely inside the United States. That last part is worth sitting with for a second. The journalist at the center of this case didn't do anything unusual by American standards. She spoke. She wrote. She criticized a government from a country she no longer lived in, using exactly the rights the First Amendment is built to protect. And according to prosecutors, that speech is what made her a target. The alleged conduct here isn't about anything the journalist did wrong. It's about a foreign government, according to prosecutors, not liking being criticized from outside its own borders and allegedly deciding to do something about it on American soil. Exiled and diaspora journalists occupy a strange legal position. They're protected by the same First Amendment as anyone born here. And they're also, according to years of public FBI guidance, disproportionately targeted by the governments they use to live under. The Bureau has publicly and repeatedly encouraged anyone who believes they're being surveilled or threatened by a foreign government to contact a local field office directly, rather than assume local police are equipped to recognize the pattern. That guidance exists because cases like this one don't look like ordinary stalking cases from the outside. I spent time going through how federal prosecutors typically build cases like this one, and here's the detail that kept nagging me. Stalking campaigns like this rarely start with a hitman. They start small. Surveillance. Someone watching a schedule. Someone learning a routine. It's slow, and it's designed to be almost invisible. That's exactly what makes it hard for investigators to catch early, and exactly why, by the time a case like this reaches sentencing, agents have often been tracking it for a long time before the public ever hears about it. That's one of the recurring obstacles in cases like this. Transnational repression plots are built to look like nothing. There's no single dramatic moment for investigators to point to. No bank robbery in progress, no drugs changing hands on camera. It's a pattern that only becomes visible once you stack enough small, separate pieces of surveillance, financial activity, and communication together. According to the Justice Department, that's precisely the kind of pattern federal agents had to assemble here. Individual pieces that, on their own, might look unremarkable, but together described a coordinated campaign against one person. There's a second obstacle underneath the first one, and it's less obvious: jurisdiction. When prosecutors allege a foreign government is connected to a plot, investigators can't simply subpoena records from Tehran. There's no cooperative law enforcement relationship to lean on. According to how the Justice Department has described similar cases publicly, agents typically have to build the entire evidentiary record from what's reachable inside the United States, plus lawfully obtained international communications and financial records, piecing together a foreign connection almost entirely from the domestic edges of it. That constraint shapes what a case like this can actually prove in court, and it's part of why cases like this can take years to reach an indictment, let alone a sentencing. Now, here's the part of this case that's easy to miss if you only read the headline. A stalking case and a murder-for-hire case aren't automatically the same thing under federal law, and prosecutors generally have to prove them separately. Stalking, in the federal statute, means a course of conduct intended to place someone in fear or to cause substantial emotional distress, carried out across state lines or using interstate communications. Murder-for-hire is its own separate charge, using money or the promise of money to solicit someone to commit a killing or agreeing to carry one out. According to court records described by the Justice Department, this case involved both. That meant prosecutors had to establish that the surveillance and intimidation of the journalist were connected to an actual plan to arrange her murder, not just harassment on its own. That's a heavier evidentiary lift than it might sound like from the outside. Prosecutors don't just need to show that someone behaved suspiciously. They need to show intent, a connection between the surveillance and the plot, and, where a foreign government is alleged to be involved, some evidence of that link, all while working within the constraints of what can actually be introduced in a U.S. courtroom. According to prosecutors, they did exactly that here, closing what could have been a significant gap between concerning behavior and provable crime. For general context, under federal law, a murder-for-hire conviction can carry a sentence as long as life in prison, and in cases where a killing is actually carried out, the statute permits an even harsher range depending on the specific charges filed. A stalking conviction on its own typically carries a lower statutory ceiling, often measured in years rather than decades. The 15-year sentence handed down here reflects the specific charges the court found proven and this particular defendant's role in the scheme, not the theoretical maximum the statute allows, and not necessarily the same sentence any co-defendant or other participant might eventually receive. The case didn't happen in isolation, and this is where the general context matters most. Over the past several years, the Justice Department and the FBI have brought a series of public cases describing plots by individuals connected to Iran against journalists, activists, and former officials living in the United States and Europe. Federal officials use the term transnational repression to describe this pattern, authoritarian governments reaching beyond their own borders to intimidate, surveil, or in the most serious cases, attempt to kill their critics living abroad. The FBI has issued public advisories on the subject, encouraging diaspora communities and journalists who believe they may be targeted to contact federal law enforcement directly. Multiple congressional hearings in recent years have focused specifically on this pattern as a growing national security concern. That's the backdrop this sentencing sits inside. One defendant is now going to prison. But according to how the Justice Department typically frames cases like this in public statements, a single sentencing rarely marks the end of a broader investigation. It's usually a milestone inside one, with other threads still being pulled by agents whose work stays out of public view until it's ready to be charged. Here's what strikes us about this case and about the pattern it fits into. A journalist doesn't get protection because a government likes what she says. She gets protection because the alternative, letting foreign intimidation reach into American cities and silence American speech, is a much larger problem than any one case. The line between foreign policy story and public safety story has gotten a lot thinner than most people assume. This isn't a case about a foreign country's internal politics. It's a case about someone allegedly recruited in Brooklyn to help carry out violence against someone living her life 2 neighborhoods away. And that reframes the sentencing we opened with. It's not really the end of the story. It's the first public confirmation of a story federal agents had already been quietly working for a long time. The sentencing itself closes one chapter, but it's worth being clear about what it doesn't close. 15 years addresses this one defendant's role, the piece prosecutors could prove against him specifically. It doesn't, on its own, resolve who ultimately ordered a plot like this, or whether the broader network prosecutors describe has been fully dismantled. That piece is still sitting, mostly out of public view, in ongoing investigative work, and it's the piece that actually matters most for whether the next journalist in this position stays safe. Now here's the part that'll probably get us some pushback, so let's just say it plainly. 15 years for a role in a plot to have a journalist killed, not merely harassed, sounds light on its face for what the underlying conduct describes. We understand there are real reasons sentences land where they do. Cooperation, the exact role a specific defendant played versus others who directed it, sentencing guidelines that weigh prior record and precise conduct proven at the specific charge level, not the worst version of events described in a press release. Still, when the alleged goal is silencing an American journalist through violence, A sentence a lot of people will read as modest is going to generate real disagreement. That's not a knock on the prosecutors who built the case. Securing any conviction in a case this hard to prove is a real result. It's a question about whether federal sentencing, as written, actually accounts for the chilling effect a plot like this has, not just on one journalist, but on everyone watching to see what happens to people who speak out. Would you have noticed the signs if you were the journalist in this case? Put yourself in her position for a second. You've built a public voice specifically criticizing a government. You know, abstractly, that the risk exists. The FBI has been public about it for years. But knowing it in the abstract and living with someone actually watching your schedule are two very different things. What do you think? Does a sentence like this actually function as a deterrent to the next person a foreign government tries to recruit for something like this? Or does it just close out a single case while the underlying pressure campaign continues elsewhere? So where does this actually leave things? The defendant in this case has been sentenced. That piece of the record is final. What remains genuinely open, and what we want to be honest about rather than speculate on, is the full scope of who else was involved, what specific role each participant played beyond what's been publicly confirmed, and whether additional charges or arrests connected to the same broader pattern are still coming. Court filings in cases like this are sometimes partially sealed while related investigative work continues, which means the public record you can read today may not be the complete picture. Sentencing itself typically comes with the possibility of appeal, and depending on whether a plea agreement was involved, some of the underlying evidentiary detail may never become fully public at all. We're not going to guess at what's sealed. We'll tell you what's confirmed, and we'll flag clearly what isn't. It's also worth restating, plainly, the principle underneath all of this. Anyone connected to a case like this who hasn't been convicted is legally presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. Charges are allegations. Even in a case where one participant has already been sentenced, that doesn't establish guilt for anyone else who may be named, investigated, or discussed in connection with the same broader pattern. That distinction matters, and we're going to hold it the entire way through, because getting it wrong is exactly the kind of thing that turns a factual case into a false one. There's a detail in how prosecutors describe these transnational repression cases that stuck with us. It's not usually the plot itself that first tips off investigators. Plots like this are designed to stay quiet. It's almost always something adjacent. A financial transaction that doesn't match a stated purpose. A communication pattern that looks routine until you compare it against a timeline. A person who behaves normally in every way except one. Cases like this get built the way most complex federal investigations get built, slowly, from the edges inward, long before any of it becomes public. By the time the public hears a sentence like 15 years, agents have usually already moved on to the next thread of the same investigation. We cut a few of the more technical legal details out of this explainer to keep it focused, specifically some of the procedural history of how the stalking and murder-for-hire counts were charged together, and how sentencing guidelines actually get calculated in a case with two connected counts like this. If you want that breakdown, tell us in the comments and we'll put together a follow-up on exactly how prosecutors sequence a case like this. Here's where this leaves us. A Brooklyn man is now serving a 15-year federal sentence for a role in a plot prosecutors say targeted a journalist specifically because of what she said, out loud, about a foreign government. The broader pattern the Justice Department describes, foreign governments reaching into American cities to silence their critics, isn't limited to one city or one case. It's an ongoing federal priority, and it's worth understanding because the next case in this pattern won't announce itself either. If you want to actually verify any of what we just walked through instead of taking our word for it, check the sources listed below. The primary record is public, and it's worth reading yourself rather than trusting any single retelling of it, including ours. If a case like this is happening in your city and you haven't heard about it, that's not an accident. It's exactly how these plots are designed to work. Subscribe if you want the next one the moment the record on it becomes public.